Delighted to have Matt Cohen from UT Austin here with us, come all this way from 90-degree weather, nearly Arctic conditions. Matt comes to us as a very, very sparkly star in the digital humanities universe. He has co-organized a number of institutes. He has been a major force, not only in his own field of English language literature, which is probably putting it too narrowly, but really been an inspiration nationally and internationally in digital humanities, and we're very lucky to have you here today. And this is, I should say, the Hall Center for the Humanities. This is one of, and we have returning guests here, so I'll just say quickly that this is one of three sponsors of the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities, the others being the libraries and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at KU. Welcome, everybody, and please come to our other events. Matt is an expert on many topics, and you can read about his biography elsewhere. One thing that caught my eye was he's written on Edgar Rice Burroughs of Tarzan fame. But we are going to hear about Walt Whitman and perhaps meta Walt Whitman today. And without further ado, very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Ariane. It's really great to be here. Thanks to all of you for coming to listen to me on what, from my perspective, is a beautiful day. It is a great pleasure to be here at the University of Kansas, to meet new folks, to see old friends as well. Today, I will talk about methodology in the humanities. I begin with a discussion of one historical episode in the most basic practice of humanities research, note-taking, annotations, marginalia, all the methods of sifting, highlighting, cutting apart, gathering. These make the substrate of our larger claims and discoveries. That is true even when we are working with big data, topic modeling, using natural language processing, and so on. I conclude with a reflection on the claims for methodology in and as what is being called the digital humanities. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to talk with all of you about these reflections, which are really emergent responses to emerging debates. Giorgio Agamben warns in his small but challenging book on methods, A Signature of All Things, that every inquiry in the human sciences, including the present reflection on method, should entail an archaeological vigilance. Must retrace its own trajectory back to the point where something remains obscure and unthematized. So let me declare up front the obscure and unthematized origins of this. My ruminations today grow from three sources. The first is a long scholarly fascination that I have had with method, with the establishment of concepts of evidence, with the relating of reading to interpretation, where both of those terms are used very broadly. The relation of method to theory, and the weaving of daily practices into concepts of disciplinarity, and then disciplinarity into daily practice and feeling. These matters have recently come back into frequent conversation in the humanities, in part because of discussions of surface reading and distant reading, subsets of its self-interrogation, particularly in the literary humanities, about how we should respond to the conjunction of defunding and changes in the cultural role of scholarly critique. The second spur to my thinking today is the active conversation about the digital humanities, of which this place has been a part. Both the tenor and the content of that conversation and its taking up of the terminology of method. These are what I'm interested in. And the third is where I will begin today. I'll leave that one out just to simmer for a while in your minds. The third is where I will begin today, which is with Walt Whitman's Marginalia. This is an example from Duke University's special collections. In his poetry, Whitman famously depicts himself as a rough, an untamed, telluric expresser of the American land and its people's way of life. Yet his annotations reveal that from classical rhetoric to the poetry of Tennyson, from Persian mysticism to 19th century phrenological journals, the influences on Whitman's work were historically deep and culturally diverse. Whitman's responses to that reading, written in standalone annotations in the margins of books and periodicals, and recorded in conversations with others, range from the caustic to the puzzled to the awestruck, and take the form of everything from simple underlining of significant passages to whatever you would call this, to full-length critical expositions. Or very short critical expositions. It is pretty bad. Scholars over the years have done much guesswork and close reading with Whitman's poetry to assert its origins or its debts to the literary environment. But these documents, scattered in at least 10 different repositories, offer concrete links and challenge a range of assumptions about Whitman and the relationship between American literature and cultural and intellectual history. If you want to trace what Y.G. Dimmock calls American literature's pathways through other continents, for example, this collection of documents is an excellent place to start. But there are formal lessons to be learned here too, because Whitman's compositional technique itself derived in part from his annotational habits. Defining any genre within Whitman's work is tricky, since he made a habit of hybridizing different literary forms for most of his career. Breaking boundaries was his style. This is a spectacular document in the Ohio Wesleyan University collections. I'll talk about it more a little later. There are thousands of documents in the archives on which Whitman wrote, for example, no more than a simple identifying citation, June 27th, 1852. Hundreds of newspaper clippings. And there are a host of documents that ponder a previous author, but that are known to be drafts of later published work or lectures, so where he's more doing composition, less doing a kind of reaction to something specific. With funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, we identified, scanned, transcribed, and when I say we, I mean a whole bunch of people other than me, who I will name later. Transcribed and will this summer make available freely to the public 800 pages worth of these documents. Documents with significant annotations that are identifiably in Whitman's hand. We call annotations notes where about reading where we can identify the text that Whitman is referring to, but he's kind of writing them on a separate sheet of paper, and we call marginalia those documents that he's actually written on. As you can see over here on the right, for example, where he's made comments on something that is another person's, usually printed, work. We make this distinction to focus on Whitman commenting on other writers' works rather than notes in which the poet is planning or revising prose pieces or poems, which are being digitized by another branch of the online Walt Whitman archive, and that's where we'll publish our stuff. You're going to see some in vivo. I don't really know what is going to happen. We'll see, because it's actually being revised by both grad students on my end and also programmers right now. Whitman's marginalia reveal crucial links between his social context and his poetry. The themes and sparks of some of his most famous poems may be found recorded in the margins of his reading in 19th century books and periodicals. Finding such connections can bring startling new interpretations to bear on Whitman's poetry, and indeed suggest useful methods for research into other 19th century authors' works. So take Leaves of Grass, for example, the poet's most influential work. Matt Miller has recently demonstrated that when we turn to Whitman's annotations, we discover a different chronicity to the composition of the first edition of Leaves of Grass than has been assumed. There's no manuscripts from that first edition, and so it's been many years of people trying to figure out how it got put together. Rather than composing his famous 1855 text largely from scratch, beginning in a mystical inspiration starting in late 1853, the poet transformed notes that he had taken earlier on a range of texts about American literary style, transformed those into long poetic lines. And I'll just show you an example of one of these documents in which he's taking notes, in this case on Greek intellectuals. This is also from Duke's collections. This is an example. The annotations such as this may not appear to be poetry, but Miller points out that not only do they often feature content that ends up in his poems more or less verbatim in many cases, but with its hanging indentation and its topical fragmentation, Whitman's annotational style looks like his signature line. More fundamentally, Miller's work suggests that Whitman's compositional method relied upon annotations no less than on poetic transformation. Whether writing poetry or prose, the poet turned to the notes that he had taken during reading or following a conversation or performance, or from his imagination, when it came time to generate his work. Thus, Whitman's annotations are key to understanding not just the sources and the chronology, but the very form of both his poetry and his prose. Indeed, it is possible to see in some annotations the layering of literary theory, content, and practice. In another document from the Duke holdings, Whitman engages with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, taking detailed notes on the French writer that will help scholars better understand Whitman's relationship to continental literature and philosophy. But the poet also makes a meta-note in the top left-hand corner there about how to handle figures like Rousseau. An American poet may read Rousseau, Whitman notes, but shall never imitate him. He is a curious study and will cause some contempt. The same thing was said about Whitman. Whitman was a textual hacker, literally and figuratively, cutting and pasting, but also messing with the codes for textual transmission, having learned the language of print firsthand at the printer's case. Nicole Gray's recently published essay on Whitman's notes and drafts in a copy of John Brainerd's poems offers a spectacular example of how one small set of marginal annotations and crossings out and cuttings out can refract the literary history of a host of poems, paintings, letters, newspaper accounts, and social interactions. For a brief period in the late 1880s, apparently, Whitman used this book, published in the 1820s and forgotten today, as notebook, scrapbook, and inspirational text. Gray suggests that, taken together, Whitman's annotational practices suggest a much broader set of uses for marginalia than the scholarly literature currently accounts for. The essential and defining character of the marginal note, according to Heather Jackson, is that it is a responsive kind of writing, permanently anchored to pre-existing written words. That is a pretty basic and convincing definition. But as Gray points out, and as the examples that I've already shown illustrate, Whitman's annotations defy even the most basic of characterizations. They are sometimes responsive, sometimes not. They are sometimes anchored, and sometimes not. They respond to pre-existing written words, but also to spoken words. Here you can see, he very often will do this. You can see, what I like about this is you can see that he made notes on it, marked them, commented in several places, and then cut them out and moved them somewhere else. And you'll often find these, the things that were cut out in one repository and the notes in another, and we've been sort of reassembling things as this project has gone forward. Here's another cutout. Whitman and Thoreau met. They exchanged books that today would be worth thousands of dollars. And I don't know what Thoreau did with his, but Whitman took it home and cut it to pieces. Gray Study goes on to suggest that a temporal rather than a spatial definition in Whitman's case might be more appropriate, that these are, in her words, occasional notes in a multivalent way. They're notes made on a particular occasion in a way that responds to the mise-en-page as well as the textual contents, but they're also often notes made toward another occasion, and the making of the notes transforms their purpose. In another example of how Whitman's Marginalia speaks to his textual practices more broadly and how we might think a little bit differently about the relationship between annotation and kind of cutting and pasting or selection, Lauren Grew has discovered a tiny fragment of clipped out, pasted on newspaper that is among the earliest evidences of Whitman pilfering text for a poem. In this case, the 1856 poem of Salutation. This is a practice whose dimensions I think we're going to learn a lot more about from projects like this one. So you can see, it's a little hard to tell, but on a base text of one page from a journal, he's pasted on something he's clipped out from somewhere else and circled it and put his very common index or manicule there pointing to it. And then in the poem, borrows lots of the language and key imagery. The marge of restless oceans is taken from that beautiful phrase is taken straight from this clipping. He's transformed it just a little bit, and the meta-ness of this marges is kind of typical and leads to another theme that I want to talk about. But first I want to make a side note, a digital humanities side note. Searching periodical databases has made our job of identifying items like this much easier. Indeed, Stephanie Blaylock over at the University of Iowa has used that technique to find hundreds of reprints and previews of Whitman's early fiction that were previously unknown, hundreds of them, which has transformed our sense of his popularity as a fiction writer. But because many of the periodicals that Whitman borrowed from are not extant today, and therefore don't show up in the digital record, or they're unlikely candidates for digitization, or because the textual transformations that Whitman did to them exceeded the dimensions of kind of computationally reasonable engrams or natural language processing algorithms for identification, we're still very much reliant on a human being looking at these things who has read the poetry, who knows Whitman's work, and can feel when there's a resonance, when something is going on. Digitization and free access to these annotations, I think, will change dominant interpretations of Whitman's poetry, partly through revelations like this about dating and sources, and partly through recontextualization. And take the famous Trapper's Bride scene in the poem that became Song of Myself. This is an unusually positive representation of miscegenation for the 19th century that involves a trapper and a Native American that he's marrying and her family and her kinship group. But there's a document in the Library of Congress that reveals a more sustained engagement with the question of the representation of Native Americans. Whitman borrowed that scene from a painting in the 1840s by Alfred Jacob Miller. But what this note on a document from 1856 suggests is that he went back to that topic and rethought it and was thinking more about it than one would suspect from either what happens in Song of Myself or what happens in his later poetry. This is from the crayon. In 56, he's marked up the text, but then he's also added a note onto the bottom of it. And I want to make, you can see kind of the way in which the sun has burned off the bottom of that paper there. I'm going to come back to this question of preservation and conservation in a minute and how they're related here. But here he references the Trapper's Bride and implies that his own treatment of the subject in The Leaves of Grass the year before was not sufficient. Has any poem yet really portrayed them? Would not the Indian be a good theme for a full poem? So this suggests that a much later poem like Osceola, for example, which fulfills this directive to devote an entire poem to the native theme, or Red Jacket from Aloft, had its origins considerably earlier than has been supposed. And the annotations speak eloquently to the recent surge in transnational approaches to literature, and I think here actually the pedagogical potential for this is also interesting to consider. Whitman's poem Prayer of Columbus, for example, parts of which are inscribed in the wall of the District of Columbia's archives and Navy Memorial Metro Station in D.C., that poem seems to have been inspired by his reading of an article in the Irish Republic. Has also long been asserted, usually based on internal textual evidence, that Whitman was influenced by Middle Eastern spiritual writing in his poetry. The Middlebury collection contains a fascinating set of documents, annotations on Persian poetry, that confirms and complicates that assertion, and that I think will do much to animate the story of American literature in deep time. And here you see some of his comments on an article on Indian epic poetry, and there are a number of comments on drama as well as spiritual texts. We also learn a lot about the poet's life from his annotations as a corpus. Having never attended college, Whitman's reading and his conversations with people, together with his visits to the Lyceum, to the theater, to the opera, these were his education. If these documents then offer insight into the self-educative possibilities of urban 19th century America, they also suggest how Whitman created himself both as a prose writer and an editor, and then how he transformed himself into a poet. This is one of many fascinating documents. I'm going to talk a little bit more about a couple of them in a moment. In this one, these seem to be notes. The heading in blue pencil would suggest that they're notes about toward an essay on Elias Hicks, who's a Quaker preacher, that he eventually wrote. But this is a list of the ages of famous figures, mostly writers, and he's thinking very much about the kind of biological trajectory of being a writer. This is shows him kind of thinking through an alternative way of criticizing literature, or thinking about how literature becomes great, what the factors are that are involved. And I'm going to pursue this a little bit more in a moment. Floyd Stovall used Whitman's Marginalia to show that the poet's shift in reading from American journals in 1845-7 to British journals in 1848 and 9 tells us that Whitman was educating himself to become a poet in those latter years, reading literary criticism and reading accounts of the lives of poets and collecting information like this. There's probably lots more to that story that's going to be much easier to assemble once we've got these things published. Indexes play a big part. This one is bizarre. Not totally sure what's going on here. I need to ask the Michael Winship at my school and some other folks, and maybe y'all know. I think that what's happened here is type that's been used for spacing has printed, and so you've got, this is a kind of throwaway sheet on the left that Whitman is using, but he's marked some of these topics and he's crossed some of the topics out, and it's very interesting to see kind of both the haphazard way in which topics are thrown together, but also the way in which Whitman's eye has been drawn to certain topics other than others. In other words, it's not just him responding to certain moments of literary art or certain kinds of history that he's trying to gather, but rather we also can get a sense of how he's ordering the universe and how he's reordering it as he encounters this stuff. Efforts at digitizing Whitman's annotations are forced to reckon with the form, the sheer mass, as well as the difficulty of the available evidence, as part of what that evidence means and its own history in scholarly accounts. Maybe because Whitman's methods of writing drew upon the form and content of his annotations and marginal notes, he held on to much of this material until the end of his life. Thanks to the fastidiousness and bibliophilia of his literary executors and friends, a large corpus of these kinds of texts survives. That is unusual. Yet the scholars that I've just cited, plus Ken Price, who wrote a book called Walt, Whitman and Tradition, which relies heavily on the Marginalia, that's kind of it. That's almost really the sort of lit review of people who've heavily relied on the Marginalia to make scholarly arguments. Largely, this is because the materials are held in archives all across the United States and are difficult to understand without the larger context of similar documents, and they've only seen limited publication. I'm going to pull back the lens for a moment because this is not just about Whitman. In the larger field of literary studies, there are few projects that gather and display an author's manuscript marginalia. There's more every day as people realize the power of this form of organization to capture them. Annotations made by writers in the margins of printed texts or images are crucial sources for analysis in literary, philosophical, and historical study. They are rare evidence of a historical figure's actual interaction with his or her influences. Even given the quite interesting evidentiary difficulties of such interactions, which are noted by Kathy Davidson in her book Revolution in the Word, which relies on marginal annotations, marginalia can demonstrate the range of influences on a writer, usually reaching far beyond the genres in which the annotator himself or herself worked. In a famous marginal note, Whitman wrote that all kinds of light reading, novels, newspaper, gossip, etc., serve as manure for the few great productions. And recall that manure is a positive term for Whitman. Wrote an entire poem about it, as compost, in which human beings are the manure. Charming. While a small number of influential scholarly studies in literature, history, and bibliography have emerged from the archival study of marginalia, that study has not penetrated the methodologies of the humanities or social sciences, in part because collections of annotations are available for comparatively few writers, Herman Melville, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and a few others. Print editions, even simple transcriptions of documents like these that combine printed text, marginalia, and images are expensive. And that cost may partly explain the paucity of published annotations collections. But even among digital archives, initiatives to preserve annotations are still comparatively rare. The powerful searching tools of a digital platform make such collections more accessible, while the availability of both images and transcriptions of text solves some ergonomic challenges faced by print editions, but not all of them. In these documents in which Whitman has pasted things on so that you can still look at the front and the back of them, it's very difficult to capture the three-dimensional sense of these texts and the way in which they've been organized. Martha Werner has talked about this a lot with Emily Dickinson's manuscripts. Digital imaging and transcription of annotations has much to offer from a preservation standpoint as well. Marginalia, as I showed earlier, they're often at the unstable edges of pieces of paper, which are more prone to fragmentation or to exposure, and just as often they're right in the middle of a piece of paper, sometimes in pencil, where they get blurred or rubbed out in handling. And we saw an entire range of conservation practices when we were collecting these documents. Some places very early on got them, put things in Mylar or some other kind of protective framework. Others didn't like that approach. So tremendous heterogeneity in the way in which preservation and conservation are related to each other. Digital presentation of annotated documents has much to offer, but in practice it's difficult to effect. The approach that we take to offering an interface for these documents reflects several important generic features of annotations and the possibilities of the digital platform for giving access to them. Annotations, after all, are a form of text markup. Themselves, a representation or reframing of an original text. Text markup is one of the major areas of digital humanities. These markings depend more, I'll talk about this example a little bit. They depend more, they depend as much on the space of the page, where they appear, and how they're managed, as much on that as they do on their textual content, or on the textual content of what they're describing in certain cases or seemingly commenting on. And the significance of spatiality in relating layers of information pushes markup based on standards such as the Text Encoding Initiative to and perhaps beyond its descriptive limits. This one we're still trying to figure out how to do. This is a collection of periodical pages that Whitman cut out and assembled on top of an 1847 article on George Washington. This is from the Trent collection at Duke University. Represented here in about a 3-inch square space. Let me zoom in. You see it's labeled Characteristics of Shelley at the top. It's a little bit more difficult to tell that down at the bottom he's pasted on two separate columns from something else. In the middle is a clipping, and then on top of that there's actually a bank accounting piece of paper. He had apparently ripped off a whole pile of this stuff, or it was given to him by somebody, and he uses it for scrap paper in this way. He turns it over, and that purple paper is everywhere in the archives, and he got it for free. So behind it, you can see that in pencil he struck out the columns on the original thing. One of the things we find fascinating, the students working on the project pointed out, is that he very often will title things at the top. He'll sometimes strike out the running head and kind of supply his own. So he's actually not eliminated the running head, he's just occupying that space generically and transforming it. Characteristics of Shelley, but the theme really here is egotism and vanity, and that this problem with poets. Let's just zoom in again a little bit to show what all is happening here in this tiny amount of space. There are challenges here on several levels of scholarly digital editing: analytical, historical, technical, and bibliographical. So first, if we think of annotations as a kind of old-fashioned tagging, this document exemplifies the difficulty of capturing metadata with more metadata. The theme of Whitman's markup here is the relationship between poets and their predecessors, or between poets and their own reputations. Whitman has manipulated the physical properties of the elements of the collage in order to relate texts without necessarily unifying them. So there's a tension between characteristics of Shelley and the idea of egotism or vanity that he is holding in suspension in this document, rather than either resolving into the kind of tension one would get in poetry, or leaving them separate fragments, which he also often does, and he could easily have done. So he's made that manipulation. The precise relationship of one of these paste-ons to another, or each of them to all the others, and to the commentary written on them or between them, all of that is what is happening in this document. That is what is essential here for Whitman. TEI-based XML makes it simple to mark sections that have been underlined or that have been otherwise grouped by a reader on a single piece of text. But this section here, labeled Poverty of Poets by Whitman, embraces 3 different pieces of paper and presumably includes the marginal note Roger that he's added to indicate which Bacon we're talking about. That note is written in the margin relative to the annotated text, but it is not in a margin relative to the whole document. That he has written over the underlying document in making that note suggests that we might treat that underlying article as insignificant, as background, basically, relative to encoding the Poverty of Poets section as an intellectual grouping that he's made that hovers over it. But can we be absolutely certain that Whitman did not intend the words uncovered requiem to peek through from down below? And even if Occam's razor suggests that Whitman's penknife just cut too close by chance, revealing those words, it should in principle be possible to allow them to appear in multiple hierarchies in our markup in order to encourage richer or more robust or more responsible interpretations. In other words, for you TEI junkies, parallel hierarchies, that old problem, this is actually ontological here. Marginalia are constitutively parallel hierarchies in which mutual dependence is a condition of reading such documents. And it gets worse, because annotations are made on images as well as on printed texts. Take, for example, Whitman's notes on this phrenological chart. The issues presented in the previous annotation are complicated here not only by the presence of an image in the hierarchy of meaning, but by the fact that the front clipping is pasted on only at its top. Whitman has positioned it so that it can be lifted and the emblematic map of the human brain underneath accessed. And even in the absence of markings by Whitman, there is the question of selection or ordering or excision. this is another page spread from that scrapbook that I talked about earlier. I think this is spectacularly beautiful. It's also kind of spectacularly horrific in certain ways. This is a representation of the course of civilization, in effect.
That all.
So this is hundreds of pages long, this scrapbook, as I think you can see. Whitman has sliced up a few geography textbooks. He's reorganized them by state and country, added extra pages so that he can put in more information as he finds it, or as it comes out. He's annotated them in some place, added dozens of clippings from other sources throughout. But it's not just geography, it's cosmography, inasmuch as the history of the natural world, comparative ethnographies, and astronomical information are all included here. Here is 19th century big data analysis and visualization at work. From Willard's Universal History, in this case, the ribbons of time and empire eerily doubled by the strata of Whitman's scrapbook itself, visible to the right. The massively general, the specific, gathered together. I think Whitman would be pleased to know that our XML files will be made available to users, and our interface design has been and will continue to be open source and hence adaptable by other projects. We're using a platform called Shared Canvas, which I'm going to show you. But I have to pop out of this, I think. Yeah. Shared Canvas involves not entirely standard-based files to link together the various layers of documents like this. They're called, these files are called manifests. They basically represent a kind of virtual space to which all sorts of information can be tied. We're interested in the relationship between a transcription that's been annotated and an image of that, the facsimile of that document. So we've collaborated with the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, which used this for their Shelley Godwin archive. And you can see this is the piece that's being worked on, I hope, as we speak. And our attempt to kind of privilege, our attempt to represent simultaneously what we've done in representing the document and the best image that we can get of the thing itself. These will be zoomable JPEG 2000 based images. This has meant that we've had to do more than just use standards-based TEI or XSLT in order to transform these things. It has required kind of stepping beyond those expectations, and there's lots of stuff we still can't do. So one of the things we're hoping is that by making it making our XML easily accessible, but also by getting some vague sense of what's going on and making it possible to copy and paste these documents into research papers and so on, to be able to find where text is that Whitman has written on a page when it can be very difficult to decipher, that all of that together will broaden the use of these documents and bring in more eyes and more talents to both to kind of change expectations for editing them, but also to make arguments based on them. This is still ultimately only going to be a rough sketch of what you see in the originals, or even in the facsimiles. The effort necessary to bring forth a digital form of the acrobatics that Whitman induced with pen, pencil, glue, penknife, and paper is extreme. The other thing we've been doing is we've been using the metadata from the XML headers of our transcriptions, which involve tracking down the sources whenever we can of all of those little clippings that he's put together. We've been using those to concoct a searchable database of Whitman's reading. For historians and for literary critics, it's just tremendously valuable to know what texts an author read, and if possible, when in their career that happened. Here's Whitman's notes again, Whitman is on the one hand a window onto practices that are not always preserved, and on the other hand he's totally strange and awesome and does things that nobody else would do. This is a copy of the Enchiridion, which was sent to him by his friend Thomas Ralston, and who had translated it. Whitman has made separate entries for each time that he has read this text, and they're in different colors of pencil and pen, so that you can actually date the readings when he's marked in the margins in red, for example. You can tie it to this last reading that he says from 1889. That's ludicrous. Nobody does this. It's very unusual to find this. In fact, if you know of examples of this from the 19th century, please tell me about it. Because one of the most difficult things to do is to make an argument from context here and say this is what people generally did. Whitman did everything. If you could do it with a knife and glue and a pen and an eraser, he did it. So, and string, all kinds of other things. So pens, he liked to pin things together or pin things to a board and then regroup them. So there are a whole host of activities here that Whitman gives us access to. So we want to make a database of all of the stuff that we know that he read, so that it makes it easy to find all of that and gather it. We're going to try to make the population of that database part of the workflow of the archive as a whole, so that people working on his correspondence, for example, can also put stuff in there. So it turns out, then, perhaps unsurprisingly, that Whitman was a thief, or better put, a filterer as much as he was a singer. But this is also an information management strategy. Markup, grouping, tagging, sifting and resifting, boiling down massive texts like that atlas or multi-volume histories of Long Island. Here Whitman is functioning as a literary historian, one who imagines that his own works will enter into and transform the flow of literary history. Let me return to this document about phrenology for just a moment and think also about that one about egotism as a prelude, sort of another version of my concluding reflections on methodology in the digital humanities, which I'll turn to in a moment. In these documents, Whitman is remixing 19th century print culture. More importantly, I think he is reshaping not just logics of 19th century print genres, high and low literary magazines, the Fireman's Almanac, put next to Harper's popular and serious scientific publications mixed together. That's important. But he is also reshaping disciplines to his ends. Indeed, it is hard to separate the activities analytically. Here is phrenology, which posits the external expression of immanent and unchangeable characteristics or capacities. Here this is overlaid on top there with an account of literary history in an exercise in modifying the self, in making a Walt Whitman that could be numbered among the literary greats. Whitman takes the logic of immanence that phrenology insists upon and uses it to the ends of transformation, to the ends of altering that which is presumably unchangeable. The same gesture happens in the many documents about egotism. Here's another document about egotism, intensely marked up. You see down at the bottom, see above and beware. Whitman interacted with lots of these documents in a very 19th century United States sort of way. Whitman tells himself to take notice, reassuring himself that he can transform himself, become a different man, even as his survey of literary history insists on strong patterns, on the weight of time and the inertia of grand tendencies. This is Whitman trying to make a new author at the junction of a big data, transhistorical description, and a particular individual, annotating and reading closely. A good example of this are the comments on Milton, inspired by reading part of the play Christopher Under Canvas by the Scottish writer John Wilson. I dare say that one's not in the canon anymore. At a juncture in the play in which characters are performing a distant reading of the canon, they begin to talk about the great writers and how you know what a great writer is, and surveying all of literary history. At this point, Whitman kind of bursts out and revolts. They single out John Milton for praise, and Whitman, you can see him over on the right, start to spew about Paradise Lost and the various problems with it and the way in which you can't compare it to certain other literary works. And he builds this up over page after page, and then in the end, here's a close-up of his sort of final comment on this. He zooms out to the global level, and he makes this move that seems very modern, where he says, well, let's put this into a different cultural context, and what would John Milton look like? He says, for instance, what nations in Asia or Africa, not Christian, would see any great point in his poem if read to them? And here are his notes on Asia. These are some of them. His notes on Africa. You can see from the way he's kind of grouped this information, tagged things, reordered it, that he is trying to move from the fragmentary and occasional mode of the marginal note to something more like an argument, something more like a claim, something to support his particular sense of grouping. Here's just a few examples of the brackets. Brackets are another thing that's extremely difficult to render in kind of the visual space of web-based, ASCII-based kind of textual transcription. And you can see here just the sheer diversity of different ways in which he has tried to group and regroup concepts, fragments of text, major figures, and their statistics about human civilization. Whitman masses, and he characterizes, as in that comment on Milton. He also particularizes, excerpts, brackets, accepts, moves, reframes, as in those cutout documents. So I want to turn to the question of method. None of the methods that I have just described, either Whitman's or the Whitman archives, are or were really new. They are configured, interestingly, and perhaps uniquely in their contexts of 19th century US reading or of computational approaches to the humanities. We might say that they are sometimes inter-methodological, borrowing ways of representing the relationship between evidence and argument from each other. Whitman borrows methods from geography or phrenology and splices them with compositional methods for making poetry. Our digitization project involves creating facsimiles of documents using standards-based scanning and storage techniques largely perfected in the library's context. And then paleography, and then triple-checked transcription according to bibliographic practices with XML encoding according to TEI standards modified by the peculiar bibliographic and intellectual formal qualities of these documents. To identify and group them in the first place, to even know what counted as marginalia or annotations, we used time-honored strategies in the humanities: bibliographic searching, formal interpretation in the larger context of Whitman's documentary remains, and lots of arguing with each other. From a bibliographer's perspective, the most important document that we created was you see a bit of here, was a hand list, a spreadsheet of all of the known annotated documents that we could find, their locations, their current titles, finding information, and so on. The most comprehensive list ever made, despite generations of editorial work on Whitman, dozens and dozens of editions. As I watch conversations about the digital humanities unfold, I sometimes wonder whether or for how long a project like this one might be described as a digital humanities project. If not, is it because in the long run, or even right now, there's a sense that digital humanities projects ought to offer analytical rather than archival products? New interfaces and tools, not just electronic facsimiles, generated by updated techniques? These are communal questions, being answered right now in many different ways. But I do think the preservation of Whitman's own tactics of deformation, annotation, gathering, and analyzing, I think that's an occasion to think a bit about the relationship between methodology and the digital humanities, commentators about which often cite its contribution of new methods as characteristic. I hope that those becoming interested in practicing digital humanities will interrogate the urge for novelty, for the new. It's been carefully dissected by people like Bruno Latour or Lisa Gittleman. Novelty rides on feelings, emotions, leanings, trendings, anxieties about relevance. It's very hard to come up with an actually new method, and that is just fine. New approaches are a little bit easier. Combinations of methods, or of methods with theories, or with reading practices, or even of those with a particular means of problem formation, or strategy for writing up your research. A new algorithm is not necessarily a new method. New software may be doing computationally what has been done by hand methodically for a long time. I wish we'd had some software that would have done this. That would have been fantastic. A new problem, or a new formulation of an old problem, is at times the most powerful contribution a scholar can make in a given situation. This is not to say that the category of the new or of novelty is not useful or important, but we are at times quick to make it a standard of judgment to dismiss the slow, the hard, the old. I get a strong Darwinian vibe from some digital humanities social media conversations, and at times, just at times, it feels less like a declaration of a new humanities and more like old-fashioned anxiety. Perfectly reasonably cued by institutional instability in the humanities, by the disjunction between collaboration as an ideal and collaboration as a sanctioning force for the PhD or promotion. You still can't collaborate to make your PhD, right? So that's a good reason for being anxious. Or maybe it comes from what Tom Scheinfeld calls the where's the beef question, about what in fact digital humanities has done to change our understanding of human life, past and present. Alan Liu calls this the meaning problem of digital humanities. He asserts that an understanding of the digital humanities can only rise to the level of an explanation if we see that the underlying issue is the disciplinary identity not of the digital humanities, but of the humanities themselves. For my part, when I consider the value of novelty, I like to think of our moment and its computational affordances in terms of what Walt Whitman called the new life of the new forms. Life under the nominalization of the digital humanities. What would that be? Most happily, most nurturingly. And forms. What might those look like in a lively way now? This is a slightly different way of saying, as Liu and Matt Kirschenbaum and many others lately have been, that the question of the disciplinarity of the digital humanities is a serious and a complicated one. When I try to contextualize what's happening in a field, or how a particular scholar's work is positioning itself within or between or beyond fields, I start with 5 categories, and you may well have different ones. I start with these. Most of these, though none so much as perhaps as discipline, have been heavily theorized and historicized and fought over in battles that I will not reenact here, but you will see in what I have to say perhaps an extension of Foucault, I suppose. Each of these has its own social sphere of people who do things that are similar, both within and usually beyond the academy as well. We operate in a quotidian way among the overlapping social spheres that our combination of these elements places us in, which we have only partly chosen ourselves. I don't want to offer definitions of these terms. Actually, the rough ones would be reasonably easy to posit. But rather, I want to suggest that as folks identifying as digital humanists, or using methods currently under that rubric, we think about the relationships among these terms, about what is related by each of these terms. When we make claims about method or about the status, dimensions, or institutional future of the digital humanities. Method, Agamben says, shares with logic its inability to separate itself completely from its context. Don Waters recently offered a summa of digital humanities, the state of it, and he writes that under the broad umbrella of that term, the tools and processes the digital humanists, quote, embrace and develop are mixed up in and not easily separated from the related intellectual pursuits. The further lesson, Waters says, is that there is no single set of so-called digital tools, but multiple sets aligned along broad methodological lines, and the vision of integrating them in a single environment or infrastructure cannot be achieved simply. I would add that these tools and methods cannot be analytically separated from the sociology of professions, the being in the H as a person. Method and feelings go hand in hand as well, such that our feelings, whether they be strong passions or warm fuzzies or tinglings of shame, these are analytical occasions. Waters doesn't talk about race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, or ethics in his overview, but these too are part of the weave of method and scholarly effects. In his short essay, Theory, Method, and Digital Humanities, Scheinfeld addresses the relationship between theory and method. He says, I believe that we are entering a new phase of scholarship that will be dominated not by ideas, but once again, as in the early days of the history of science, which is his particular field, by organizing activities, both in terms of organizing knowledge and organizing ourselves and our work. Our difficulty in answering where's the beef stems from the fact that as digital humanities scholars, we traffic much less in new theories than in new methods. The new technology of the internet has shifted the work of a rapidly growing number of scholars away from thinking big thoughts to forging new tools, methods, materials, techniques, and modes. Or work which will enable us to harness the still unwieldy but obviously game-changing information technologies now sitting on our desktops and in our pockets. I've added the emphasis here. I couldn't agree more with Scheinfeld that, as he puts it, we need to make room for both kinds of digital humanities. The kind that seeks to make arguments and answer questions now, and the kind that builds tools and resources with questions in mind, but only in the back of its mind for later. Absolutely. But between these two quotations, method has slipped closer to tool. And a new tool is not the same thing as a new method. So I want to explore this just a little bit more. Wikipedia's shifting definition of digital humanities suggests the uneasy place of the concept of methodology within it. This is the way Matt Kirschenbaum reported the Wikipedia definition in 2010 in his article on what DH is doing in English departments. The digital humanities, also known as humanities computing, is a field of study, research, teaching, and invention concerned with the intersection of computing and the disciplines of the humanities. It is methodological by nature and interdisciplinary in scope. It involves investigation, analysis, synthesis, and presentation of information in electronic form. It studies how these media affect the disciplines in which they are used and what these disciplines have to contribute to our knowledge of computing. An ambitious and very broad definition. As it stood on December 3rd, 2013, it went like this, which is an important downgrading of method to accompany a downgrading of institutional gravity from field to area. The digital humanities are an area of research, training, and creation concerned with the intersection of computing and the disciplines of the humanities. Developing from the field of humanities computing, so it was a field before, now it's at the moment at which it seems as if Alan Liu and Matt Kirschenbaum are saying disciplinariness is approaching, the definitions seem to be sliding the other way. Foucault would say, red flags, something is happening you must pay attention to. developing from the field of humanities computing, digital humanities embrace a variety of topics from curating online collections to data mining large cultural data sets. Digital humanities currently incorporate both digitized and born digital materials and combine the methodologies from traditional humanities disciplines and social sciences with tools provided by computing, such as data visualization, information retrieval, data mining, statistics, text mining, and digital publishing. I think today this definition is still pretty similar on Wikipedia, although the last time I checked, digital humanities praxis had sneaked into the foundations. I don't know, Wikipedia or no, maybe definitions are just layered hacks. At its core, Kirschenbaum concluded in that 2010 piece, digital humanities is more akin to a common methodological outlook than an investment in any one specific set of texts or even technologies. That subtle formulation, methodological outlook, is important, I think. An outlook is an interesting thing to base an intellectual formation around. Or rather, perhaps it is a profoundly common thing to base an intellectual formation around, but it is uncommon to declare it as such. To be grounded only in method does not seem to satisfy the demands of scholarship, which asks for comparison, interpretation, argument. The shift from method to methodological outlook may then be regarded as salutary, both because it invites a range of participants and perspectives, and because it qualifies the centrality of method. But then again, from the field of literature, the new critics had a common methodology with close reading at its heart, but perhaps more importantly had a more or less shared methodological outlook. That outlook today is often critiqued for its non-interdisciplinarity, its depoliticizing of literature, and its failure to historicize. There are, we might then say, virtues and potential hazards to linking a label like digital humanities or literary criticism to a common methodological outlook. Mark Sample writes that the heart of the digital humanities is not the production of knowledge. It's the reproduction of knowledge, and that the promise of the digital is not in the way it allows us to ask new questions because of digital tools, or because of new methodologies made possible by those tools. The promise is in the way the digital reshapes the representation, sharing, and discussion of knowledge. Now, I am inclined to agree with Mark much of the time. And while I certainly have been arguing today for an appreciation of the ancientness of many of our methodologies, despite the newness of our apparatuses and techniques, I still want to tweak his metaphor of the heart. The impulse to establish norms, standards, edges, edginesses, and the smart through its contrast, the boring, the repetitive, the passé. Imagining a computational humanities with maximum latitude, with a past, and with the past's claims still upon it, is, I think, a powerful way to guide the transformation of the humanities more generally. So back to Walt Whitman's room in Camden. This is from the 1890s. That's the stuff that I'm putting online. Yeah. This is a great story where his biographer and helper and literary executor Horace Traubel comes over, and Whitman says, a woman came by today and she wanted to buy a copy of November Boughs, which had just been printed the year before. And I don't think we have any more. And Traubel says, oh, Walt. And he hunts around through all of this and he finds 6 copies of it. So, but also back to Ladurie. Tomorrow's historian will have to be able to program a computer to survive. Programming has not yet arrived in the general requirements for the history PhD. Though it is worth noting that tomorrow, for a social historian of the longue durée, might mean within a few hundred years. Still, we are not exactly repeating the scholarly concerns of the moment in which Ladurie uttered the statement that I have taken as my epigraph. At that time, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, an increasing use of computational techniques by historians was one part of a larger shift from an approach to history that emphasized the unity of spirit repeated in a series of historical moments, to history as a series of more fundamental shifts, transformations, breaks. Here in the States, anyway, it's not usually the computational enactments of that new historiography that we still use to teach our students to think about concepts of history and power. It's people like de Soto and Michel Foucault. And yet, Soto's and Foucault's capacity to reformulate historiographic visions and vocabulary surely owes something to the methodological ecology of that moment in the history of history writing. Perhaps we might take then the new as a concept and indeed a feeling that budding digital humanists should interrogate, both out there in the public world of digital humanities work and in here, in the soul. We don't talk about the soul in the academy, but there's Walt looking at me. And if the body is not the soul, then what is the soul? In our reactions to things, triggers to think about how we do what we do. Magnificent innovations in method often come from trying to answer very old questions. Magnificent new questions often emerge from the application of very old methods. Whitman's Marginalia can be considered a material expression of his intermethodological approach, blending scientific and geographic forms of study with poetic compositional methods. The distinction between Whitman's techniques of annotation and his methods of composition, I think, is important to draw, because it tells us something about how material practice, about the boundaries between things, can be used to reorganize conceptual expectations, that is to say, boundaries among concepts. And that is an important point of reflection for digital humanities practitioners today. Method links outlook with material practice. Attention to method as newness can obscure attention to both material practices and shared outlooks, often ancient shared outlooks. In Whitman's Marginalia, we watch a person dismantle and reform the knowledge of his time. We witness a method that cannot be described in terms confined by interpretations of his poetry or his own statements to his biographer or to interviewers, or by our own definitions of marginalia. He is abandoning traditional analyses of power and of the dominant literary institutions, and he's thinking about the form of a literary life. That life in terms of its practices, in documents hacked, mixed, erased, marked, remarked. Still, this practice did not yield in Whitman a full-scale embrace of what we would call anti-racism or Native American self-determination or a public formulation of what we would today call his queerness. The Marginalia show Whitman's contradictions and the weaving of his methods with his human places and times. In turn, in editing his Marginalia into digital surrogates, we reenact this reformation, a new weaving with new places and times. I feel that we can learn something from Whitman's methodological recombinatory restlessness, that capacity for elaboration in those contradictions, in the larger framework of the long history of gathering and interpreting in which our computational practices take a part. Thank you. Here are the people I must thank because they did the work. These are folks spread all over the place, mostly in Nebraska, Texas, but some good folks at Maryland, as well as our library partners. We've had funding both local and national, so thanks to all of those folks, some of whom I've talked about their research as well.
Questions?
I get a little ill just looking at that spreadsheet again.
Well, I see the scrapbooks that Whitman has put together and that you've digitized, and of course then I begin to think of, what is the late 20th, early 21st century writer who's a Whitman-esque type person?
Right.
who's writing his own blog and then is putting sticky notes on that own blog, who's then hyperlinking to some kind of commentary in the New York Times. And how are we ever going to wrap our minds around that person's literary legacy or historical legacy, even if we can capture it all digitally?
Yeah.
When does the mind run out of space to hold on to all of this?
It does for me very rapidly. That's a great question, and my students will often ask me, like, if Walt Whitman were alive today, what would he be doing? How would he be embracing this? And I actually think that it's a kind of a complicated question, because these documents for Whitman are very much a private, most of the time, they're a private space where he can work out this sometimes, very strange, kind of desire to put things together to create new analogies without that which publication produces in the polish, the boiling down, or the smoothing over of a document. In his case, that means a very careful creation of roughness, a curation of what will appear to be a kind of burst of spontaneous, kind of coagulation of reality. But nonetheless, he's careful who he shows the manuscript Marginalia to. And when Traubel mentions it in his biography, it's intensely interesting when Whitman will choose certain things. Whitman burns stuff. I mean, Traubel comes in every now and then to visit him, and he's chucking letters into the fire and grinning, and because he knows everybody else wants to see these things. So I would say an attentiveness to the dynamics of privacy and publicity in the way in which those are materially mediated. The difference between a blog and the notes that you take on a laptop. And that's where I would really sort of say the rubber meets the road in terms of our preservational practices today. I think, for example, about the David Foster Wallace collection at the Harry Ransom Center at Texas. Wallace has a wide range of annotational techniques, like Whitman did. A lot of them were not things that a lot of folks knew about before he passed. But he's also somebody who was intensely interested in his public presentation and in thinking carefully about form, literary form, and the personality of the author and how one might relate those in the modern media world. But one of the difficulties is actually capturing the way in which documents transform when they're constructed originally on a word processor. Matt Kirschenbaum has done a lot of work on this recently. His book Track Changes, I think, is a fascinating meditation on this. How do we think about the archivability of our transformations of text, of our kind of stages of composition, and that as something that we have used to help understand human history for a long time? So I think that's a great question. And I think there are many tendrils of it.
Footnote, there was a room at the there is a room at the Whitney Biennial in New York City right now that is about Marginalia, and they have David Foster Wallace's
Excellent.
notebooks on display in one corner, but they're only presented as one part of several artworks.
Well, this also with a writer like Wallace, who is writing about people who are still alive and his family and so on. With contemporary writers, even the act of preserving those things is tricky, has a lot of complications. Mark Twain, another example, who says, "Don't publish this thing until I've been dead 100 years." Whitman's kind of control of these documents. There are lots of arguments about why he was interested in controlling the circulation of various kinds of documents. Pictures of himself with his male lovers, for example, which Ed Folsom argues he circulated among a small group of sort of like-minded folks who understood what was going on there, and not widely. or documents with an even smaller group of folks in which you see him doing this kind of ruminating and comparing and trying things out and failing. So I think, thinking carefully about how we would reconstruct those and how we will know how to identify 20 years from now what constituted that now is the historiographic problem that we face.
I was just wondering about the cultural context of Marginalia for him. It seems to me he's doing so many different things. I mean, many times you'll see someone jotting in the margin, but his construction essentially of new documents by cutting and pasting, and sometimes the original document is part of the process, and sometimes it seems to just be a background, that it's just a piece of paper that we're putting things on. And I'm just wondering if that combination is so unique and so out of the cultural context of the time that it's very obvious what you look at something, oh, that's what Whitman did.
Right.
Or was it common that people cut and pasted? And I'm just sort of wondering what other people were doing at the same time.
I wish I could answer that question with bibliographic rigor. We're getting closer to being able to provide provisional answers. I can say that in the archives that I've worked in, and I'm thinking about also about work like Ellen Gruber Garvey's on scrapbooks, for example. The scrapbooking stuff that Whitman does is relatively common. It grows in popularity over the course of the 19th century. And some of his habits are very familiar in the sense that he will, in small notebooks or in scrapbooks, collect things that are interesting to him or that are related to his life that have appeared in print, and he'll gather those. In others, I've never seen anything like it. But what I think is it is probably safe to say is that I don't know of another writer who uses the range of different techniques that he does. Very often, Melville's Marginalia offer, I think, a good comparison. There's a great edition of that currently being developed by Stephen Olsen-Smith at Boise State, and it's also a free online archive. It's being done in collaboration with a number of institutions, including the Houghton. And with Melville, you see something that is not terrifically uncommon. He has a code for his marginal marks, and he'll sometimes write the code in the beginning of the book. A squiggly line means this, a caret means this, and then you'll see those marks in the book. Relatively small, very often terse responses, and when you pick up book after book after book, that's pretty much what his responses look like. There are exceptions, and they're important exceptions. But with Whitman, when you, I thought I had seen it all. I thought after Duke that, the range of things like this and cut and pasted things and folded up and torn apart was going to be complete. And then I had a moment where I realized that we hadn't even really thought about scale, and it's something that Whitman actually did think about. In the Library of Congress, there's a super royal sheet, kind of issue of a paper that's folded up, and it was in the Marginalia folder, and we looked at it, and we couldn't see anything on it. There were some blue lines, but it wasn't, there was no writing, nothing seemed to have been marked. And we opened it, and the research assistant took a step back from the table and realized that, in fact, he had written about a 3-foot-high pointy hand in great big blue pencil on it. So, in fact, it was a giant, and I don't even know how we're going to represent that, but because you have to get about 10 feet away just to take a picture of it, because the sheets are giant. But learning to look for what the marks are in the first place is one of the difficulties. There are others too, because Whitman's stuff is in a lot of different libraries and archives, and because and sometimes passed through a number of hands. Whitman's documents survive in part because they had the kind of emotional attachment that I was sort of talking about us needing to take control of as we do this work and maybe write about and talk about. It very much had that value for people. It was a laying on of hands to have a document of Whitman's. So there are multiple people's writings on there, stamps from different institutions, some of which have more boldness about where you, I mean, the Boston Public Library, you know, big, like, you know, press mark right in the middle of it. So that also makes it difficult because one can see how uncharacteristically broad a picture of his practices we have in Whitman's case, and not so much in other folks. So I actually think that's one of the most important questions to answer is how would one describe a 19th century American context for making marginal annotations? I think Jackson has done a lot of great work and William Sherman has done a lot of great work. They're on the board of this project, and that's been really, really helpful. So one thing I think I'm likely to do is just sort of, you know, invite Heather kind of early to sort of surf through the ones that we've got and say, okay, what do you think? Yeah.
Well, I was wondering if you might be able to comment on how prevalent the annotations were just within the broader sense of what Whitman was reading.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you didn't annotate it, you might be able to know that you read it. So does he annotate everything he reads? Does he annotate a small portion, but we have a lot of it? Where is that?
That's a great question too. I'm going to, with Michael Winship's voice in my ear, I'm going to say first the things we definitely don't know and probably can't. So we can't know if the things that he read that we don't have were annotated or not. Partially because we don't have the documents, partially because we can't trust what Whitman says about them, and because it is safer to make arguments from documents we know the provenance of. Let's put it that way. So another thing we know is that Whitman was reading very widely and talking very widely with his friends and other literary figures about the reading that he was doing. In all likelihood, he read tons more than what we have. We don't know enough about his library borrowing practices. Tom Augst has a great chapter on this in his book, The Clerk's Tale, and I'm very curious to know about that. He was loaned books a lot. He was loaned magazines and newspapers a lot. With certain friends, he feels no compunction about writing Marginalia and sending it back. With others, he wouldn't do that. And I would love to know what the story of the Brainerd volume was, for example, like why did that book get resurrected 60 years after it was published and then become this? I mean, I don't have an investment in really judging literature as being good or bad, but it's pretty bad. So I don't know what happened. But I think that we can say a couple of things. One of them is he made lots and lots and lots of annotations, lots of them. Yes, it is true that it is more likely that a book that has marks in it is going to survive than one that doesn't. But he very often wrote his name in the fronts of the books, and so we have a number of them that have very few or no markings. Bryn Mawr has a number of books that just have his name in the front, and some of them bear evidence of having been read, in the sense of the pages have been, you can tell these books have not been rebound, so you can tell that they've been manipulated. That gives you a certain amount of evidence, together with Whitman's citation of things or his discussion of things, either in his conversations or in his prose writings. But that's a different kind of argument one has to make. There are a number of strange practices. So it's pretty rare. I've shown some of them because I find them intensely interesting and they inspire a lot. They inspire lots of passion in Whitman, but he usually doesn't mark poetry. He usually doesn't get in there and do a lot of commentary on it. His copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam is a great example, it's held in the HRC, and it's got his name again, and the front of it, there are a number of passages that are marked in it, but not much kind of engagement with it. So that's an interesting habit. With certain writers, he gets his back up, and he has to kind of go for it. But even things that he'll write stuff about elsewhere, there's Tennyson's Maud, for example, comes out. We have his copy of it. He didn't mark very much on that. But on another, it's cited. Maud is mentioned in a clipping somewhere else, and Whitman circles it and pastes it in, and he says, "I have read Maud. It will not live long." So we can see that he's not always expressing the interaction that he's having. He's reserving things. We can also see him going back and revising things later. He's got a reaction to Longfellow's Hiawatha that's just fascinating, in which I can't remember what it is. I dare not say, but he adds. The initial comment was clearly pretty appreciative, pretty adulatory, and he goes back and qualifies it. He adds a couple of qualifiers later on. It's sort of hard to tell that he writes over a period to sort of bring down the level of praise. So yeah, that's a great question. I think when I can say this about the scope of what we have. We promised to do 800 pages. That's about 100 documents. I mean, sort of average around 8 pages. We tried to scan everything that we could find. The Library of Congress does not do scanning, so you have to take all the pictures yourself. That was much harder and much more expensive. We got hundreds and hundreds of pictures there, but there's way more. There's much, much more stuff. And we only looked in the Whitman collection, the Feinberg collection. We didn't look in the Harnett collection. So we saw, if you throw in clippings that just have, a date on the top, I mean, we've got 3,200 images that we took. I would guess there are probably 10,000 pages worth of stuff. That's a ludicrously large archive for any 19th century figure. When one compares it to the manuscript archive of, say, Shakespeare, it causes certain morbid reflections. But I think it's, and this is another problem. So this is the other thing that came up. What do we do about the fact that he keeps clippings and groups them and clearly sometimes steals language from them? Those then clearly are really important engagements of reading. I've been wondering if one of the things we shouldn't do, I mean, we haven't really been aggressively digitizing the clippings because they don't have much of his writing on them, and it's hard to make a case to get funded to do that. And yet, boy, I mean, if we had all of that stuff, if we could OCR all of that and then just do a little bit of textual comparison with engrams from the poetry and that data set, there's no telling what we would discover. So now I'm thinking, maybe we should have been doing all the clippings all along too. Yes?
I was interested in the final section of your paper. I'm not sure I entirely understood all that you were saying. It's very dense. But as someone who funds this kind of work, I don't work in it, but I do help to fund it. Where's the beef is a question that obviously I have to ask myself. And I suppose my version of that has become, when will digital humanities work or findings begin to influence the disciplines? When will it actually join the essential historiography of those disciplines? Now, it might be occurring already in some fields, I don't know. But really what I'm asking you, is that the right question I should be asking? Which is, not until it enters the essential historiography will it have really proved its worth. Is that the right question?
I would never tell someone who is funding digital humanities initiatives to raise the bar any farther. I'll be honest. I think that this is one of the most exciting areas of inquiry, and it's like any other inquiry area, right? There are people who are producing field transformative things with it. I mean, Ted Underwood is a really good example of someone who took the history of the field itself as a starting point for doing this kind of work. That's a brilliant move because it gives him leverage. He's not just able to say, well, look, I can show you something you didn't know before about where the field of English studies came from. But he can also say, it is worth thinking to ourselves why that method revealed it when the ones that we've been using all along didn't. So that I think is an excellent example of that kind of work. But there is another level. I will say this. So the idealist in me says, yes, I would ask that question, and I would ask another one, which is to what degree are projects in the digital humanities bringing creativity and a kind of transformation of the very questions we ask? What counts as historiography to begin with? How much are they doing that? Because when I think about the kind of things that, well, here's an example. So the field of literary studies. In the 19th century, American literature was not a topic of study. It was not regarded as an evidentiary base that was worth taking on. To read American literature alongside British literature and the world literature and so on was not a move that involved a transgressive methodological transformation. It was just content. It was adding content that simply hadn't been considered before. But one of the risks that was being undertaken by doing that was in suggesting that the periodicity of literature was not what it had been understood to be. That influence flowed in a certain kind of course of empire, translatio studi sort of way, and that, as Americans often argued, this was the new empire, and this was the new place to find an original kind of literature. So those questions were not questions that had really been central to literary studies. The bringing in of American literature into that canon and into pedagogy and into research projects meant that new questions about the very periods by which one understood literature, the connection between literature and nationalism, the relationship between an individual's vision, the idea of genius, and the culture that surrounds them. Suddenly new questions were being asked as a result of that. So I would say yes and no. I think that's a very good question to ask and an important one. And I think that it has institutional dimensions in pedagogy as well as in research. But I would also, I guess there's just some part of me, there's the Whitman in me that says, yes, but also, you know, what I would love to see is a digital humanities project that made me rethink what literary study means. And I don't know what exactly that would look like. But I feel like in the process of trying to pursue that, many wonderful things will be created that will have effects all over the place. The other thing I guess I would say is the interdisciplinary dimension is important. Yeah, I was trained as an American studies person. I was, you know, my field exams were in history, literature, and art history, and I barely survived, and you know, it was painful, but it was tremendously important to learn the historiography of those disciplines, the very real social investments that the people working in them had, their histories of conversation, as well as their methods and their content. So I feel as if digital humanities has an interesting role to play in the discussion of what interdisciplinarity would be now. What are the common occasions that would spark new kinds of research and new insights? And what occasions, and in what way can those occasions also feed back into ongoing work in traditional disciplines that continue to produce expansive, fascinating transformations of how we understand human history and thinking? Those were awesome questions. Thank you all. And thank you very much for bringing me.
Delighted to have you.
Are you going to put this out, what we've been talking about today?
I don't know. I was thinking about it on the plane as I was making it more dense.
Dense, not in the sense of...
I really was making it more dense in the negative sense. I don't know. I haven't, I haven't published much in what's called digital humanities. And I really do, in certain ways, think about my work that I'm an editor. I mean, my imperatives when I sort of work on these projects are really very old-fashioned and traditional. And that's one of the reasons I can see what's so crazy about these documents. But there are many things about them that I must say I did not perceive until we tried to put them in TEI. And it just broke. Everything broke. And then we started to think about, well, how are we going to render it with a style sheet? I mean, the whole point of marking this up is not just to capture intellectual structures and to allow for portability, but to allow for them to be represented in different ways, in print, on the screen, to be able to transform these documents. We have a rubricator. You can see all of Whitman's words in red. I asked for that one. Little bits of irony drops throughout the project, but that kind of thing is what you want to be able to do, to sort and sift and reform and give other people the opportunity to write their own style sheets and do what they will with it. But boy, once we started thinking about this, we realized that in fact, the confusingness of all of this is actually one of the things you want to try to capture. To make it too easy for a viewer is really kind of to make an interpretation. It's to sort of say some of this is more important than others, or the way in which we tend to look at ASCII text on a screen ought to be like this. And that just seems completely out of touch with what's happening here. So it's really both, the editorial enterprise and the kind of techniques that we use now that brought out some of this and made us look around, for example, at other kinds of documents and in other collections and say, in your scrapbook with this, is there anything in there that might be interesting? So I don't know. I also don't, the other thing that's happening is that the debates about method and the digital humanities are unfolding very rapidly, and it's hard to keep track of it all. So I don't know. I have to think about whether I'm the person to do that or not. And we'll take Matt Kirschenbaum out to lunch and ask him.
No, I would encourage you to publish this, because I think your arguments about approach versus method, and especially that interdisciplinary approaches are not just about collaboration, but they're about stimulating things. These are very important counterexamples to the typical kind of, oh my God, digital humanities is a Trojan horse that is introducing positivism and neoliberal capitalism and Silicon Valley. I'm not kidding.
Yeah. That's one of the
approaches into the academy. It's fighting everything we fought for.
Right.
It's a little more subtle than that.
That's a strong strain in the conversation, and there are others as well. I mean, on the other side, there is this sort of, this will save us all. This is the let the information be free and all will be well. I think it's we've had a lot of debates at the University of Texas, for example, about whether to have a digital humanities center, what that would mean. There's a lot of people in different disciplines doing very interesting, or across them, doing very interesting digital humanities work. We have a School of Information where there's tremendously fascinating stuff going on, and that we're collaborating across school boundaries. I've collaborated with a computational linguist on a topic modeling based approach to disambiguating, automatically disambiguating toponyms, for example, just a very basic tool that would be great for analyzing literature or historical documents. But the move to kind of institutionalized at a place like Texas where there's already that much going on is a really important one, and it's going to be meaningful, and ideally will be done very carefully and thoughtfully, so as to not only to contribute to the much broader ecology of digital humanities thinking, but also the local one. Like, what is strong here? What do we do well here? And what do we need in order to be able to ask new questions? What will put us in a position to do this in the richest way? But also a way that is locally powerful and that can feel its own, kind of sustain its own intellectual energy. Yeah. I'll think about it. That is good encouragement.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.